Situated in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, the tiny island Republic of Malta is a treasure trove for history lovers. The walled city of Mdina, which was the island's capital until the arrival of the Knights of the Order of St. John, contains some very old and spectacular palazzi, testament to the fact that it was a stronghold for the island's nobility. One of these is Palazzo Falson. It is the second oldest building in Mdina, and parts of it date back to the 13th century. Palazzo Falson takes its name from the Falsone family, to whom it belonged in the early 16th century. Like many of the other palazzi in this walled city, this palazzo has a long, complex and interesting history, which even includes hosting Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam in 1530, as a result of the island being donated to the Order of St. John by Emperor Charles V. The Order of St. John of Jerusalem began as a monastic community which ran a hospital in Jerusalem to care for pilgrims to the Holy Land. Apart from their hospitaller mission, the order also took on a military role, becoming a defender of the faith and of the territories conquered by the Crusaders from the Muslims. When the last Christian stronghold of Acre fell to the Muslims in 1291, the order first settled in Cyprus and then in Rhodes, where it remained until 1523. During this time, it put together a powerful fleet and sailed the eastern Mediterranean fighting for Christendom. Having been ousted from Rhodes by the Turks 7 years earlier, the knights arrived in Malta in 1530. In 1565, they faced the Turks once again in what became known as the Great Siege of Malta. This time, led by Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette and heavily supported by the Maltese, the order emerged victorious. Long before the arrival of the Knights, Mdina was already a centre of government and enjoyed a long history of opulence. However, as the order was a seafaring one, it moved to Birgu on the Grand Harbour, and then on to Valletta, when the new capital city was built after the Great Siege. In more recent times, Palazzo Falson was the home of Olof Frederick Gollcher, a remarkable man who left his mark on this palazzo and his legacy for us to enjoy. Olof was an artist, a philanthropist, and a collector with an avid interest in all things artistic and historic. His ancestors were Swedish, and his great-grandfather Johann Gustav had arrived in Malta in 1848. Johann Gustav's son, Olof Frederick, after whom our Olof was named, set up the O.F. Gollcher & Sons shipping agency in 1854. This firm provided services from Malta to several Mediterranean ports and is still operational today. The first Olof Frederick married the daughter of a local judge, Giacomo Pantaleone Bruno. Judge Bruno was a cousin of Fra Gaetano Bruno, the conventual chaplain of the Langue of Auvergne, as well as secretary of the chancery of the order during the time of the last two Grand Masters who reigned in Malta at the end of the 18th century. Fra Bruno became legendary by saving not only some of the knights' treasures from being plundered by the French during their brief occupation of the island, but also much of the order's archives, which the French intended to destroy as well. Olof Sr. and his wife had 10 children. The Gollchers were a distinguished and prominent family, and many of its male members were honored with consular appointments. One of Olof's children was Gustav Gollcher, a businessman. He married Eliza Balby from an equally important family, and they had only one son, Olof, who was born in Valletta in 1889. Part of young Olof's education was received in England, and this included 2 years at Dulwich College in London. In 1914, he joined the British Army, serving in the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment. In 1920, his father Gustav bought property in Via dei Gracchi in Rome, and Olof seems to have lived there with his parents for a while. It was at this time that he became involved with a group of artists who called themselves La Confraternita della Pipa, or the Brotherhood of the Pipe. They had their seat in an underground cavern in Via Margutta in Rome, where they held their meetings and exhibitions in what appears to be a most bohemian manner. A parchment hanging in the studio of Palazzo Falzon features the emblem of this group of artists, as well as their signatures, and indicates that Olof was, in fact, their leader. The Brotherhood had statutory laws. Its members had to be initiated and wore capes and costumes to carry out their mysterious rites. The Brotherhood's subterranean world was full of dancing and chanting sounds and shouts. In this band of brothers, Gollcher made some lifelong friends, whom he visited whenever in Rome throughout the subsequent years. He must also have acquired from, or exchanged paintings with, these artists, because in later years he donated works by some of them to what is now the National Museum of Fine Arts in Valletta. Although not well known as an artist in Malta, Olof achieved some success on the continent. He was particularly praised for his etchings and lithographs, and one Italian newspaper even referred to him as a maestro del bianco e nero. He exhibited at the Circolo Artistico and all the major exhibitions in Rome, as well as in Bologna and Milan. He also exhibited at the Salon in Paris, and 2 of his works featuring Amalfi were accepted for exhibition by the Royal Academy in London. In 1927, Olof bought part of Palazzo Falzon with his mother, and later on bought the rest of what can be seen today. He renamed it the Norman House, no doubt inspired by the Siculo-Norman style drip mold of the main doorway. Olof immediately set out to embellish his palazzo with architectural details that he had seen on his many travels. He was particularly fascinated by the grand castles of Europe, and brought back with him countless postcards as well as notebooks in which he sketched details of what had struck him most. Within this palazzo, he managed to incorporate a fountain, inspired by one found in the Benedictine cloister in Monreale, Sicily, a staircase from Palazzo Pretorio o del Podestà in Florence, as well as a turret, all of which were placed in the internal courtyard. For the interior, he designed a number of fireplaces, such as the one in the dining room, in the hood of which he incorporated a carving of Grandmaster Lila Dam's coat of arms to commemorate his historic visit to this palazzo. He also designed the friezes of the Sale Nobili, which he painted together with fellow artist Victor Flerisola. Gollcher was also a scholar whose research took him far and wide, ferreting out historical details in the archives of Parma, the National Libraries of Naples and Florence. This interest is also represented in his collections, which include various documents, manuscripts, and a collection of papal bulls. Gollcher's scholarly interests were one thing he held in common with his maternal uncle, Major Henry Alexander Balbi, a noted researcher who published important studies about the Order of St. John. Olof later on paid tribute to his uncle's memory by publishing Major Balbi's translation from Spanish to English of Francisco Balbi de Correggio's 1567 Verdadera Relación, which was a diary of the Great Siege of Malta of 1565. To write the foreword of this translation, Olof invited Sir Harry Luke, who was Lieutenant Governor of Malta from 1930 to 1938. Luke was a great friend of Olof, and they both shared a love of books. Olof frequently gave Harry book gifts, especially after the latter's library was destroyed during the Blitz of 1942. In the carpet gallery of the palazzo is a watercolor featuring a local landscape by the English artist and celebrated author of nonsense verse Edward Lear, which was a gift from Harry to Olof. A number of honours were bestowed upon Olof throughout his life. In 1936, he was invested as a Knight of Grace of the Venerable Order of St. John for his patriotism and charitable work. Both Uncle Henry and Olof's mother Eliza were members of the same Venerable Order. In 1935 and in 1936, Eliza and Olof donated some items of special interest to this order, including the treasures, which more than a century before had been safeguarded by Fra Gaetano Bruno from the French. As, after the departure of the French, the order never regained Malta, these treasures remained in the Bruno family and eventually devolved on the Gollchers. This bequest included some notable silver objets d'art and some Imari porcelain jars that were given to Fra Bruno by Grandmaster Emmanuel de Rohan around 1780. In 1937, Olof was invested as an officer of the Order of the British Empire. The press described him at the time as being very popular in Malta and well known for his extremely charitable disposition. This was an apt description of Gollcher, who that same year held a dinner for 100 old people at a local government school to celebrate the coronation of King George VI. This event was meticulously planned and organized on a grand scale. An important person in Olof's life was Anthony Kauki, his accountant, right-hand man and confidant. But above all, Olof and Anthony were great friends and often convened for a hearty meal together. Gollcher's letters to Tony often included quotations from the books that most interested him, or even verses he penned himself. Anthony's niece Angèle still remembers her uncle with affection.
Uncle Tony, or Nini or Tony, as he had several names, took over from his father, who was Ollie's mother's accountant. So they were more or less the same age. So I think he was more than an accountant to him. He was very much of a personal friend.
1938 was a busy year for Olof. That year, he married the Italian-born Teresa Lucia née Prior, known to all as Nella, and also purchased the rest of Palazzo Falzon. He also bought Villa Brunswick in Imjar, a village in the northwestern part of the island. The villa was his haven and retreat, and the surrounding land was turned into a fully functional farm. Luigi Abela was only 8 years old when he first encountered Captain Gollcher, as his father had been engaged to tend the land around Villa Brunswick. A few years later, Luigi took over from his father, and up to this very day still farms the land and tends to the livestock there.
Għalija marriċ ngħid li aqwa minn missieri, aqwa mill-familja tiegħi. Ġieb li rispett aqwa mill-familja tiegħi. U kien l-ikbar ħabib tiegħi jiena kont nħobbu ferm ukoll għax kont dejjem ma saqajh, u dejjem kien iġib li rispett, mhux lili biss. L-imġar kollu min isejb bonġu bonasera u li kollu bżonn la fqir u sinjur patri assejs u xinu ikellmu bonġu bonasera u jkellem il-kulħadd. Għal-mixi ma kienx jaħab bil-moħħu, għal-mixi kien jimxi bil-baston u jimxi kemm meritu. Ngħidlek bil-mixi dejjem. U kien joħroġ fid-9 u jasal għas-6 u nofs is-saħtejn dejjem.
Olof spent World War II serving as liaison officer for the Malta Home Guard. In May 1942, the Norman house suffered some damage from enemy action, and in his diary he recalls removing debris and saving the furniture. Despite his military commitments, Olof was still able to continue his charitable work, and in 1943, he threw a party for 250 refugee children at the Norman house, which was followed by the screening of a film at the nearby cinema. Gollcher was an extremely well-travelled gentleman, often departing for months at a stretch. He enjoyed hunting and fishing, and often went on trips to hunt duck or wild boar in Italy. In 1934, he embarked on his own version of the Grand Tour, a round-the-world trip which took in, among other places, Japan and South America. Another of his stops was in San Francisco, where he met up with other Gollchers. It was there that he became a Lutheran. He particularly enjoyed driving on the continent in his motorcar, never being deterred by engine and other technical difficulties, which seemed to plague most of his trips. The person who seemed to hear the most about these unfortunate incidents was obviously his friend Anthony, who also had the task of liaising with and keeping the peace between Olof and the car dealers. Gollcher was a Freemason, becoming a member in 1947, and his Masonic regalia is on display at the Palazzo. In Roman Catholic Malta, Freemasonry was not looked upon favourably. Indeed, it was frowned upon, which meant that gollcher was regarded with suspicion in some quarters. By all accounts, Olof was a very friendly and sociable man, and was known as Ollie by those who knew him best. His wide circle of friends and acquaintances at times reads like a who's who of his generation. On occasion, Olof was described as a businessman, but most often as a man of independent means. This left him plenty of time to pursue his scholarly interests, to travel, and to tend to his collections. He did at one time consider turning his interest in antiques into a business concern with one of his Italian friends. Inheritance and family money were certainly the foundations of his collections, which he added to and modified to suit his taste over the years. His father Gustav also appears to have had an interest in antiques, and purchased some arms which can today be found among the wide array on display at the Palazzo's armory. Other collections also include some priceless pieces such as this fob watch with a 10-hour dial, which reflects French Revolutionary time, based on a day being divided into 10 hours, with 100 minutes each having 100 seconds. This system did not prove popular and reverted to the traditional system in 1806. This watch was made in Paris in 1791 by Robert Robin. Few examples were produced, most of which no longer exist, making this one, possibly one of only 3 in existence, quite exceptional. Gollcher's paintings collection also includes some remarkable works, such as The Death of Lucretia by Mattia Preti, A Vanitas by Urien van Streek, A Portrait of a Boy attributed to Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, A Tavern Scene attributed to David Tenier the Younger, and a portrait of a Genoese noblewoman in the style of Anthony van Dyck. Gollcher's collections were admired even during his lifetime. He appears to have been a very gracious and generous host, who delighted in showing people around his beloved Norman house and its objets d'art. Numerous people wrote to Olof asking him if they could bring friends and other guests over to the house. And at times, he even got requests from people he did not know. A number of illustrious visitors also visited the Norman house in Gollcher's time, including Their Majesties King Gustav Adolf and Queen Louise of Sweden, and the Earl and Countess Mountbatten of Burma. Gollcher seems to have developed a passion for underwater archaeology quite late in his life. In April 1959, he wrote in the local newspaper about the underwater archaeological discoveries made in Sicilian waters close to Malta. Gollcher's suggestion was that a team should be formed to search the approaches to the Maltese coast, and through his efforts, the Malta Underwater Archaeological Branch was set up in 1961. Gollcher was the secretary of this association, the headquarters of which were located at the Palazzo. The team was successful in recovering objects of historical value around Malta and Gozo, most of which were presented to local museums. Earlier in 1943, Olof had proposed to donate the Norman house and all its contents to the Venerable Order of St. John. This bequest was to come into effect after the deaths of both him and his wife. However, it never materialized, as the order eventually felt it could not take responsibility for the house and its collections. Gollcher's secret will of 1960, therefore, decreed that a foundation bearing his name would be established to carry out this wish. All the movable objects found in the Norman house at the time of his death were to remain there and were not to be removed, and his trusted friend Anthony was appointed testamentary executor to carry out these instructions. Moreover, the aim of the foundation was to enrich the Malta National Museum with objects of art and archaeology, and to fund studies in historical and archaeological subjects. In his will, Gollcher also specified that he wanted his heirs to preserve all his letters, private or personal, and all other papers dealing with or in connection with him. These have allowed us a deeper glimpse into Olof's lesser-known private persona.
And he'd say, come, come, come. There's something for you. There's something waiting for you. And I'd find Puss in Boots. Another time it was a tortoise, which was called Swift. And then came another tortoise, so I had Mr. and Mrs. Swift. But not only that, he went to the trouble of having a house made for Swift. It was like a little cottage with a red roof, a sliding roof, a nice big door so that it could open and Swift could go in comfortably. It was called Villa Swift. He had painted it. And then the windows were painted with little curtains, with little flowers. I mean, it meant that he went to a lot of trouble, and he really cared to make a little girl happy. And he had a very large jar, a glass pharmaceutical jar full of barley sugar. And one barley sugar would be for me, and the other one would be for Sally. Sally was the donkey, and would go and give Sally the barley sugar.
Gollcher was very fond of animals, having numerous pets throughout his life. In his will, he even left provisions for the upkeep of all his pets for the rest of their natural lives. In this clause, he also included the donkey at his farm, who, according to local hearsay, lived to a ripe old age.
Għamlet il-baby, hawnhekk, u meta tlu l-ħmar għandha l-baby, ġie s-senjuwi u s-senjura għamlu ċoffijiet hawnhekk, ħomor u roża. Bil-fliexken tat-tufi, u ċ-ċikkolata, t-tfal iduru għaw, jitihom iċ-ċikkolata u t-tufi u narawa tieħu l-ħalif minn għand omma. U sejma hija s-senjura għal issa din jisimha Sally.
Loyal to the end and beyond, Anthony continued his involvement with the Gollcher Foundation for about 20 years after Olof's death. Anthony died on the 27th December 1988. After Gollcher's death, the palazzo remained closed most of the time for almost 40 years, during which the ravages of time and adverse weather conditions took their toll on the fabric of the building and its works of art. In 2001, Fondazione Patrimonio Malti, a non-profit-making Maltese heritage foundation, reached a management agreement with the Gollcher Foundation and set about restoring the palazzo as well as all its collections to their former glory. Patrimonio's objective is that of promoting and disseminating Maltese heritage through research, publications, and exhibitions. Its forte lies in setting up exhibitions showing previously unseen artifacts from private collections. Prior to taking on the Palazzo Falson project, it had organized 9 exhibitions featuring Maltese clocks, silver, costume, and furniture, among others. An exhibition featuring Maltese prehistoric art even travelled to Florence, while the one about Sicilian Maiolica was also set up in Ragusa and Caltagirone in Sicily, as well as The Hague. The Palazzo Falzon restoration project was an intensive one that lasted 5 years, and great care was exercised in diligently preserving its original features. All the stonework throughout the entire palazzo had to be cleaned and conserved, and replaced only where absolutely necessary. Parts of the building that had deteriorated over the centuries had to be restructured and secured. When the plaster of the interior walls was peeled off, cracks in 3 stone arches at ground floor level were discovered, which meant that the first floor was at risk. However, the removal of the plaster also yielded a previously walled-up aperture, which offers more clues into the building's early history and orientation. The 3,700 objets d'art were all removed to a separate location for conservation, while the restoration and consolidation of the building was underway. Many professionals lent their expertise to this cause. Olof Gollcher's wish was finally fulfilled in May 2007, when Palazzo Falzon Historic House Museum finally opened its doors to the public. Olof died in 1962, the year he had finished putting together the final touches of a manuscript entitled The Normans in Southern Italy and Sicily, the culmination of his lifelong fascination with this subject, which, regrettably, never made it to print. Nella's unfortunate death took place a few weeks after Olof's, after she missed her footing when at a top-floor window of the Norman house, and fell onto the stone floor of the patio. Being a Lutheran, Olof is buried in Tabraxia, a cemetery for non-Roman Catholics. His grandfather and namesake is also buried there, and his monument is as grand as it is poignant. The younger Olof's grave, located only a stone's throw away, is not as elaborate. It is a sober affair in the neoclassical style, with a simple epitaph that sums up his main preoccupations in life. In Mdina, however, Captain Gollcher is commemorated by an altogether different monument. A historic house museum that befits his exuberant and larger-than-life personality. In the rooms of Palazzo Falzon, his erstwhile beloved Norman house, Gollcher's spirit and memory will always be present.